The photographer was already counting down. 3, 2. My mother suddenly leaned forward and whispered sharply, "Wait, not him." The entire family turned. 20 people standing on the lawn behind my parents' house, dressed perfectly for the annual holiday photo. My boyfriend Daniel was standing next to me, holding my hand, and my mother looked directly at him and said, "I'm sorry, but you can't be in this one." Daniel slowly let go of my hand. The photographer lowered the camera awkwardly. My father cleared his throat. "It's just, family photos are important," he said. Daniel nodded quietly. "I understand." But then my mother added something that changed everything. "We just don't want the wrong person embarrassing the family pictures." I felt Daniel's fingers tighten slightly before he stepped back. And in that moment, I realized something. They thought Daniel was the embarrassing one. They had no idea that the decision they just made was about to cost them $4 million. Before we go further, if you've ever had someone judged by your family before they even knew them, I'd love to hear where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments. And if stories like this feel a little too real, consider liking and subscribing to Unvoiced Truth, where silence reveals everything. Now let me tell you what happened the day my parents tried to erase the man I loved from a photograph. I was 29 years old the day of that photo, and I already knew my parents didn't approve of Daniel. They had been polite about it at first. Too polite. The kind of politeness that sits on top of judgment like a thin sheet of ice. My name is Natalie Carter. I grew up in a family where appearances mattered more than almost anything else. Not love, not honesty, appearance. My parents weren't billionaires or anything dramatic like that, but they were very comfortable. My father owned a chain of dental clinics across the state. My mother ran charity boards and social committees that came with endless brunches and perfectly staged photos. Our house had always been spotless, our clothes always coordinated. And every Christmas, we took a family photo that looked like it belonged on the front of a greeting card. My mother framed them all, every year. They lined the hallway like a timeline of carefully curated perfection. Matching sweaters, perfect smiles, nothing messy, nothing real. When I was a kid, I thought it was normal. By the time I was in college, I understood something. Those photos weren't memories. They were advertisements. Advertisements for a life my parents wanted people to believe we had. I met Daniel 3 years before that photo. And ironically, I met him on the worst day of my life. I was standing outside a hospital parking garage at 2 a.m. My car wouldn't start. I had mascara running down my face from crying, and my phone battery was dead. I had just spent 8 hours sitting next to my grandmother's hospital bed, while doctors tried to stabilize her heart. When I tried turning the ignition again, nothing. I remember slamming my forehead against the steering wheel, and that's when someone knocked lightly on the window. I jumped. A tall guy in a dark hoodie stood outside the car. He held up a small portable battery starter. "Sorry," he said gently through the glass. "I saw you trying to start it." I rolled the window down halfway. "I think my battery's dead." He smiled slightly. "Probably." 10 minutes later, my car started. I tried to pay him. He refused. Instead, he said something strange. "If your grandma's upstairs in ICU, they usually have bad coffee in the waiting room." I blinked. "How did you—" He shrugged. "I work here." "Doctor?" He laughed softly. "Maintenance." That was Daniel. No dramatic first impression, no perfect entrance. Just quiet kindness at 2 a.m. We started seeing each other slowly after that. Coffee first, then dinner, then long walks after his evening shifts. Daniel worked incredibly hard. He had 2 jobs at the hospital, maintenance during the day, security overnight on weekends. But what surprised me most wasn't how hard he worked. It was how carefully he listened. When I talked about my stressful corporate consulting job, he didn't try to impress me. He just asked questions. Real ones. Not the polite ones people ask at networking events. And for the first time in my life, I felt like someone was seeing the real version of me. Not the polished one. Not the one from the photos. The messy one. The tired one. The one who sometimes hated the life my parents thought was perfect. When I finally introduced Daniel to my family, my mother smiled politely. Too politely. "Oh," she said. "What does he do?" "Hospital maintenance," I answered. Her eyebrows lifted slightly, but her smile stayed. "That's nice." My father shook his hand firmly, but the conversation ended quickly. Later that night, my mother knocked on my bedroom door. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "you can do better." I remember sitting on the edge of the bed. "What does that mean?" She sighed. "You're a Carter. And? And people notice who you bring into a room." That sentence sat in my chest for weeks. But Daniel never made me feel small, never tried to compete with my family's expectations. He simply showed up, consistently, kindly. The funny thing was, Daniel never cared about the things my parents obsessed over. He didn't care about the neighborhood we lived in, or the expensive restaurants my family preferred, or the charity galas my mother dragged me to. But he cared deeply about people. He volunteered at a youth shelter every Sunday. He helped elderly neighbors fix broken appliances, and every time my grandmother had another hospital visit, Daniel quietly showed up with coffee and snacks. My parents noticed that. They just never acknowledged it, because kindness didn't photograph well. The day of the family photo, I thought things might finally change. My parents had invited Daniel to Thanksgiving for the first time. My mother had even told me, "Of course he can come," which felt like progress. But I should have known better, because right before the photographer lifted the camera, my mother leaned forward and said, "Wait, not him." And just like that, Daniel stepped out of the frame, like he didn't belong, like he was something to edit out. But what my parents didn't know was that earlier that morning, Daniel had already signed paperwork connected to something that would completely change their understanding of who he was, and more importantly, who I was. Because the embarrassing boyfriend they just removed from their family photo had quietly helped me build something my parents would only learn about after I walked away that day. Something worth $4 million. And by the end of that afternoon, their perfect family photo was going to look very different. Daniel stepped back without arguing. That was the first thing everyone noticed. He didn't protest, didn't roll his eyes, didn't make my parents uncomfortable. He simply released my hand, gave me a small, reassuring nod, and moved to stand near the edge of the lawn. Like he had already expected this. The photographer looked awkward. Are we ready now?" My mother clapped lightly. "Yes, perfect." She straightened her sweater and motioned for everyone to move closer together. Family only. That phrase hung in the air longer than she realized. Family only. I stood there in the center of the group, but my chest felt strangely hollow. Across the grass, Daniel shoved his hands into the pockets of his worn jacket. He smiled politely when our eyes met, like he was trying to tell me it was okay, but it wasn't. The photographer raised the camera again. "Everyone look here." I didn't move. My father leaned closer and whispered through clenched teeth, "Natalie." But I was still looking at Daniel, and something about the calm in his face made the moment even harder. Because this wasn't the first time he had quietly accepted something unfair. 3 months earlier, my parents had hosted their annual spring charity gala. It was a big event. 200 guests, local business owners, doctors, lawyers. My mother loved these events. They were half fundraiser, half social performance. Everyone dressed perfectly, Everyone networking. Everyone pretending to be more important than they probably were. Daniel had come with me that night. He wore the only suit he owned. It was simple, a little worn at the cuffs, but clean and carefully pressed. When we walked into the ballroom, my mother greeted us near the entrance. Her smile was tight. "Oh," she said quietly. "You brought him." I felt Daniel's hand stiffen slightly. "Yes," I said. "He's with me." She leaned closer to me. "You should have told me." "I did." "Yes, but I assumed—" She hesitated. "Assumed what?" Her eyes flicked toward Daniel. "Never mind." But the rest of the night, she introduced me to people alone. Daniel stood beside me, invisible in conversations that deliberately excluded him. At one point, I noticed my father guiding a group of donors away from our table when Daniel joined us. That night, in the car ride home, Daniel stared quietly out the window. "Are you okay?" I asked. He shrugged. "They just don't know me yet." It was the kindest interpretation possible, and it broke my heart a little. Back on the lawn, the photographer lowered the camera again. "Natalie?" he said. I realized everyone was staring at me. "You need to move closer to your sister," my mother said sharply. Camilla was smiling perfectly. Her fiancé stood beside her. He came from a wealthy family my parents adored. My mother loved mentioning that his father owned 3 medical clinics. Victor and his wife stood on the other side of my father. Perfect, polished, exactly how my mother liked things. But there was a strange, quiet building inside my chest, the kind that happens right before a decision. My father spoke again. "Natalie, let's not delay everyone." I looked at him, then at the row of perfectly dressed people around me, then at Daniel standing alone by the edge of the lawn. And suddenly, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Clarity. So I stepped out of the line. The photographer blinked. "Oh, are you not—" "I'm not in the photo," I said calmly. My mother's smile dropped. "What?" I walked across the grass toward Daniel. Behind me, I could hear my mother's heels clicking quickly. "Natalie!" she hissed. Guests on the patio had started watching now. "What are you doing?" I turned toward her. "You said family only." "Yes." "So I'm choosing mine." Her face flushed. "That is childish." Daniel shifted beside me. "Natalie, it's okay," he said softly. But I shook my head. "No." Then I looked back at my parents. "You know what's interesting?" My father frowned. "What?" "You think Daniel would embarrass the family photo?" My mother folded her arms. "It's not about embarrassment." "Oh?" I said quietly. "What is it about then?" She didn't answer, because the real answer would have sounded exactly like what it was. Status, image, class. My father cleared his throat. "Natalie, we invited him for dinner. That's already a compromise." Compromise. Like Daniel's presence required negotiation. I felt Daniel's hand gently touch my arm. "We can go," he whispered. And that was the moment everything shifted, because my parents assumed we would leave quietly, embarrassed, ashamed. But instead, I smiled, not an angry smile, a calm one. "Actually," I said, "we were planning to leave soon anyway." My mother threw her hands up. "Well, fine." She turned back toward the photographer. "Let's just take the photo." But before she could turn away completely, I added something. "Oh, and Mom?" She looked back impatiently. "Yes?" "You should check the mail later." She frowned. "What mail?" I shrugged lightly. "The envelope that arrived this morning." Her confusion was immediate. "What envelope?" My father stepped forward. "What are you talking about?" Daniel looked at me carefully. He knew that tone in my voice, the one that appeared whenever I had already made a decision. "The one from Carter Holdings," I said. My father blinked. That's my company. Yes, I said softly. But today, it's also mine. Silence spread slowly across the lawn. Camilla lowered her perfect photo smile. What? Victor frowned. Natalie, what are you saying? I met my father's eyes. 3 hours ago, the sale finalized. My mother looked confused. Sale of what? And this was the moment where the truth finally started surfacing. Because my parents had spent 30 years building their reputation around one thing: control. Control of their business, control of their image, control of the family narrative. But what they didn't realize was that the quiet boyfriend they had just removed from their family photo had been sitting beside me during every single meeting that made today possible, and the envelope waiting in their mailbox contained the official confirmation that their daughter had just walked away from the family company with $4 million. I looked at Daniel, then back at my parents. You didn't want him in the picture, I said calmly. That's okay. Because the next thing I was about to say was going to make the entire lawn realize something my parents had never bothered to learn. The man they thought would embarrass their family was the only reason I had the courage to leave it. For a moment, no one spoke. The wind moved lightly through the trees behind the lawn, rustling the leaves like the world was continuing normally. But the group standing in front of the photographer looked frozen. My father stared at me. The sale? He repeated slowly. Yes. My mother frowned. What sale? Victor stepped forward slightly. Natalie, what are you talking about? I folded my arms loosely, not defensive, just calm. The consulting division. My father's face tightened immediately. That division belongs to the company. Yes, I said. And until this morning, I owned 30% of it. Victor blinked. 30? Camilla looked confused. Since when do you own any of Dad's company? That question made a few relatives exchange glances, because technically, they were all aware that I worked for the company. What they didn't know was what I actually did there. My mother always told people I helped with paperwork. Something soft, something supportive, something that fit the version of the story she liked telling. But that wasn't reality. For the past 6 years, I had built the consulting division almost from scratch. Corporate restructuring, dental practice acquisitions, financial advising for small medical offices. At first it had been just me, sitting in a corner office no one used anymore. My father had barely paid attention. But within 3 years, the division was bringing in more revenue than 2 of the clinics combined. That was when things changed. My father didn't congratulate me. Instead, he said something I never forgot. Well, I guess it's useful. Useful. Not impressive, not important. Useful. Just like when I was a kid helping clean the kitchen after family dinners. Useful. I realized something that day. In my father's mind, I was never supposed to outgrow that role. Back on the lawn, Victor was still staring at me. You sold your shares? He asked. Yes. To who? I gestured slightly toward the street. A private firm. My father's voice sharpened immediately. You can't sell company equity without my approval? I tilted my head. You might want to read the shareholder agreement again. His eyes narrowed, and suddenly, I saw it. Recognition. The memory coming back. Because 10 years earlier, when the company expanded, my father had needed outside investment. At the time, he gave me a minority stake in the consulting branch as part of my compensation package. He thought it was harmless. He assumed I would always stay, always cooperate, always prioritize family over leverage. But contracts don't care about family expectations, and neither do investors. Victor rubbed his forehead slowly. So, you walked away with $4 million? Yes. My mother looked stunned. 4 million? I nodded. The final number after taxes will be a little less. She shook her head slowly, like the math itself offended her. That's impossible. But my father wasn't arguing about the money. He was staring at Daniel. A long, quiet stare. The kind men use when they're trying to recalculate everything they thought they knew about a situation. Then he looked back at me. Who helped you negotiate the deal? I smiled slightly, because this was the moment. The one where the quietest person in the entire scene finally became visible. I reached for Daniel's hand again, and held it. He did. 20 heads turned at once. Daniel blinked. Natalie, but I squeezed his hand gently. It's okay. My mother let out a short laugh. Him? It wasn't a laugh of humor. It was disbelief wrapped in judgment. He's maintenance staff at a hospital. Daniel didn't react. But I did. Yes, I said. He was. My father's voice dropped lower. What do you mean was? I watched Daniel for a second. He hated attention. Always had. But he also knew something important about today. This wasn't about embarrassing my parents. It was about correcting a lie. So I answered for him. Daniel studied finance. My mother blinked. What? Before he started working at the hospital. Victor frowned. You never mentioned that. Daniel shrugged slightly. It never seemed important. But I continued. He graduated top of his class. My father crossed his arms. Then why is he fixing air conditioners? Daniel answered that himself. My dad got sick during my final year. His voice stayed calm. Medical bills stacked up fast. So I took the first stable job I could get. No one spoke. He continued. Maintenance at the hospital came with health insurance. My aunt lowered her eyes slightly. Daniel wasn't dramatic. He wasn't defensive. He was just honest. And suddenly the picture my parents had painted of him started cracking. I squeezed his hand again. Daniel has been helping me analyze company financials for 2 years. Victor stared at him. You helped structure the sale? Daniel nodded once. Mostly Natalie did. But that wasn't true. Without Daniel, I never would have had the confidence to make the decision. My father's voice came out quieter now. You've been planning this. Yes. My mother stepped closer. But why? And there it was. The question that had been sitting underneath everything since the photographer first lifted the camera. Why leave? Why walk away? Why now? I looked around the lawn, at the photographer who was pretending not to listen, at my relatives who suddenly looked unsure what story they were standing inside. Then I looked at my parents. You didn't want Daniel in the family photo, I said. That's fine. But the truth is, he's the only reason I realized something. My father frowned. What? I met his eyes. I've spent my whole life trying to fit into a picture you designed. My voice stayed steady. But Daniel never asked me to do that. A quiet breeze moved through the lawn again, and I took a slow breath. Today wasn't about embarrassing you. My mother's voice trembled slightly. Then what is it about? I answered honestly. It's about choosing a different life. Camilla looked stunned. You're just leaving? Yes. Victor's voice softened. Where will you go? I glanced at Daniel, then back at them. That's the part you don't know yet. Because the money from the sale, the $4 million sitting in my account, was never meant to buy a bigger house, or a nicer car, or a more impressive life. It was meant to fund something my parents would never have approved of. Something Daniel and I had been quietly building for the past year. Something that would make the man they just removed from a photograph the center of a story much bigger than their family name. And when they found out what that money was actually for, they were going to realize something that had never once crossed their minds. The most embarrassing thing in that photo was never Daniel. It was the way they had treated him. The lawn felt smaller now, not physically, but emotionally, like the air itself had tightened around everyone standing there. Victor was the first one to speak again. "What kind of life?" he asked. I looked at him, then at Daniel, then back at the house I had grown up in. The white columns, the polished windows, the hallway inside filled with framed family photos. Perfect smiles, perfect sweaters, perfect lies. Daniel gently squeezed my hand. "You don't have to explain," he murmured. But I shook my head. "No, I want to." Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to protect my parents' image. I was telling the truth. "We're starting a foundation." My mother frowned immediately. "A charity?" "Yes." My father's tone turned skeptical. "With $4 million? It's a start." Victor leaned slightly forward. "What kind of foundation?" I answered simply. "Medical debt relief." A few people exchanged confused glances. My aunt asked quietly, "What does that mean?" Daniel spoke this time. "Helping families pay off hospital bills." His voice stayed calm and steady. "Especially the ones that force people to choose between treatment and bankruptcy." Silence settled again. But this silence felt different. Less tense, more thoughtful. My mother, however, looked irritated. "You're giving away $4 million? "Not giving away," I said. "Investing." She shook her head in disbelief. "That's irresponsible." I almost smiled, because that was exactly the reaction I expected. My father crossed his arms. "You worked 10 years building your position in this company?" "Yes." "And now you're throwing that away for a charity project?" I held his gaze. "It's not a project." Victor spoke quietly. "How long have you been planning this?" Daniel glanced at me. "About a year," I said. The truth was, it had started the night Daniel told me about his father. We had been sitting on the hood of his car outside a diner, cheap coffee in paper cups, streetlights flickering above us. Daniel rarely talked about his past, but that night he did. "My dad delayed treatment for 6 months," he told me quietly. "Why?" "He didn't want my mom drowning in medical bills." My chest tightened. "What happened?" Daniel looked down at his hands. "By the time he finally went to the hospital, the cancer had spread." I remember the silence that followed. Then he added something that stayed with me. "It wasn't the illness that scared him most." "What was it?" "The bill." That sentence sat in my head for months, because around the same time, I had been sitting in corporate meetings watching investors argue over percentages and acquisitions worth millions. Millions moving around like numbers on a screen. Meanwhile, families like Daniel's were collapsing under bills that were a fraction of that. That's when the idea started forming. Not dramatic, not sudden, just persistent. Back on the lawn, my father exhaled slowly. "You're being naive." My mother nodded quickly. "Exactly. You can't fix healthcare with a few $1,000,000. "I know," I said. "But we can help some people." Daniel added gently. "Even if it's just a few hundred families. That matters." My father looked at him sharply. "You think charity solves structural problems?" Daniel didn't get defensive. "No." "But it changes individual lives." That answer hung quietly in the air, because it wasn't grand, it wasn't idealistic, it was simply human. Camilla looked confused. "So you're just walking away from money?" I shrugged slightly. "I already have money." Victor rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "You could have expanded the consulting division instead." "I could have. But that's not the life I want." My mother's frustration finally bubbled over. "This is ridiculous." She gestured toward the photographer, who was still awkwardly waiting near the tripod. "We're standing here arguing about this in front of everyone." I nodded. "Yes." Because this is the moment you told my partner he would embarrass the family. Her cheeks flushed. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? She didn't answer. Because the real answer was too obvious. Image, status, the same invisible rules that had shaped every decision in our house. My father finally spoke again. And this foundation, what exactly does Daniel do in it? I smiled slightly. He runs it. Daniel blinked. Natalie? But I squeezed his hand again. You do. My father laughed once, short, disbelieving. You're putting $4 million under his management? Yes. Daniel looked uncomfortable, but also touched. He knew how much trust that required. My father shook his head. This is exactly why I was worried about him. I frowned slightly. Worried? Yes. You're letting emotion guide major financial decisions. That sentence would have crushed me 5 years earlier, but now, it just sounded tired. Daniel helped structure the entire financial model, I said. He knows exactly how the foundation operates. Victor looked curious. What model? Daniel hesitated, but I answered. We're not just paying off bills. We're negotiating them. Victor's eyebrows lifted. With hospitals? Yes, Daniel explained quietly. Hospitals often sell unpaid medical debt to collection agencies for pennies on the dollar. Victor nodded slowly. I've heard that. We're buying those debts first. Several people leaned closer now. My aunt whispered, You can do that? Daniel nodded. Yes. Then we forgive them. The words hung in the air like something fragile. My father looked at him differently now. Not impressed, but thinking, calculating. Because suddenly the maintenance worker he dismissed earlier sounded like someone who understood financial leverage very well. Still, my father wasn't the type of man who admitted being wrong easily. He looked at me one last time. You're making a mistake. I shook my head gently. No. Then I glanced toward the house, at the hallway filled with perfectly staged family photographs. And honestly, I think the biggest mistake I ever made was trying to fit into those pictures. My mother's voice softened slightly. You're really leaving? Yes. Victor asked quietly. Tonight? I nodded. Daniel and I had packed the car that morning, not because we expected a fight, but because we knew something important was ending today. I looked back at the photographer. You should take the picture. My mother blinked. What? The family photo. She hesitated, then slowly turned back toward the group. People awkwardly returned to their places. The photographer lifted the camera again. But something had changed. The smiles looked different now, less polished, more uncertain. And for the first time in 30 years, I wasn't standing in the frame. Daniel and I walked slowly toward the car parked at the end of the driveway. Behind us, I heard the photographer say, 3, 2. And the camera clicked, capturing the most honest family photo they had ever taken. One missing daughter, and one missing story. But the real surprise my parents didn't understand yet was what would happen 6 months later, when the foundation Daniel and I started quietly began changing thousands of lives, and suddenly, the man they thought would embarrass their family name would become the reason people respected it. 6 months later, I received a message from Victor, just 3 words. Turn on the news. I was standing in the small kitchen of the apartment Daniel and I had rented near downtown. The place wasn't fancy. 2 bedrooms, old wooden floors that creaked when you walked across them. But it felt peaceful in a way my parents' house never had. Real. Daniel was sitting at the dining table surrounded by paperwork and a laptop. Stacks of hospital debt portfolios covered the surface. When I turned on the television, a local news anchor was speaking. Behind her was a headline across the screen. Local foundation erases $42 million in medical debt. Daniel looked up slowly. Oh, he said quietly. They ran the story. I stared at the screen. The reporter continued talking. A newly launched nonprofit called the Second Chance Health Fund has quietly purchased and forgiven over $42 million in medical debt across 3 counties. They showed footage of families receiving letters, people crying, a mother hugging her teenage son, an elderly man wiping his eyes. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. We weren't trying to make it public yet. I smiled softly. But it happened. And the truth was, it had grown much faster than we expected. The $4 million we started with didn't disappear. It multiplied. Not financially. Impact. Hospitals were willing to sell debt bundles for a fraction of the value. $100,000 could erase millions in bills. And suddenly, our quiet plan was changing hundreds of lives every month. People we would never meet. Families we would never know. But every letter they received carried the same message. Your medical debt has been forgiven. You owe nothing. That afternoon, my phone rang. My mother's name appeared on the screen. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but I answered. Hello? She sounded different, quieter. I saw the news. I leaned against the kitchen counter. Okay. A long pause. You didn't tell us. I looked across the room at Daniel. He was pretending not to listen. We tried to tell you, I said gently. You didn't want to hear it. Another pause. Then she asked something I never expected. Is Daniel there? Yes. Can I talk to him? I raised my eyebrows slightly. Sure. I handed him the phone. He looked confused. Hello? I couldn't hear my mother's words, but I saw Daniel's expression soften slightly. No, Mrs. Carter, he said quietly. You don't need to thank me. Another pause, then he nodded. I understand. He handed the phone back after a minute. What did she say? I asked. Daniel shrugged slightly. She said she might have been wrong about me. I laughed softly. That's the closest thing to an apology you'll ever get. 2 weeks later, Victor visited our office, if you could even call it that. It was a small converted storefront, second-hand desks, whiteboards covered in financial models, stacks of envelopes waiting to be mailed. Victor walked in slowly, looking around. This is it? For now, I said. He nodded slowly. Then he saw Daniel talking to a volunteer across the room. Victor watched him for a moment. You know something funny? Victor said quietly. What? Dad clipped every newspaper article about the foundation. I raised an eyebrow. Really? Victor nodded. He won't admit it, but he's proud. I didn't answer right away. Because my father being proud had stopped being something I built my life around. Still, it was interesting. Victor continued. And Mom took down the family photo from Thanksgiving. That surprised me. Why? She said it didn't feel complete. I looked down at the desk for a moment. That sentence landed somewhere deeper than I expected. 3 months after that, Daniel and I attended a small community event. Nothing fancy, just families we had helped, gathered in a park. A woman in her 60s approached us with tears in her eyes. My husband died last year, she said quietly. The hospital bills were destroying us. She held up a letter. Our debt was in the batch your foundation bought. Her voice cracked. You saved my house. Daniel shook his head gently. No, you earned your house. But she hugged him anyway. Long, tight. And as I stood there watching that moment, I realized something. My parents spent decades worrying about how the family looked in photographs. Perfect smiles, perfect clothes, perfect reputation. But standing in that park, surrounded by people whose lives had changed, I understood something they never did. The most meaningful pictures in life are the ones no one stages. A month later, my parents visited our office. It wasn't dramatic. No speeches, no emotional reunions. My mother walked in, looked around, and said, "This place could use better lighting." Daniel laughed. My father shook Daniel's hand firmly. Then he looked at me. "You built something important." Those 4 words were the closest thing to approval I had ever heard from him. And strangely, it didn't feel as important as I thought it would. Because I had already built a life where his approval wasn't required anymore. Sometimes people ask if I regret leaving that family photo. I don't. Because the truth is, my parents thought Daniel would embarrass their pictures. But the real embarrassment wasn't him. It was the way they measured people. By status, by appearance, by what looked good in a frame. And the day I walked away from that lawn, I finally stopped trying to fit into a picture someone else designed. Instead, I chose a life that meant something. If this story felt personal to you, tell me what boundary you had to set. Thank you for listening.